The missing details. In the entire biblical canon, few passages are as mysterious, debated, and frustratingly brief as the opening lines of Genesis chapter 6. In just 4 short verses, the text describes a time when the sons of God came down to the daughters of men. The result of this union was a group known as the Nephilim. The Bible calls them the mighty men who were of old, the men of renown. And then, almost immediately, the narrative moves on to the great flood. Genesis never explains exactly who they were. It never explains how tall they were, what they looked like, or what they actually did to corrupt the earth. It simply assumes the reader already knows the story. But while the biblical author remained silent, other ancient voices did not. For centuries, scholars wondered if the brief mention in Genesis was merely a fragment of a much larger, forgotten epic. That question remained unanswered until the year 1947, when Bedouin shepherds stumbled upon a hidden cave near the Dead Sea. Among the thousands of ancient manuscript fragments recovered from Qumran, researchers found something entirely unexpected. They pieced together an ancient Aramaic document that did exactly what Genesis refused to do. It gave the Nephilim a voice, a history, and a terrifying sense of impending doom. This document is now known as the Book of Giants. The Book of Giants is a fragmented text, but what survives is striking. Unlike the Book of Enoch, which focuses heavily on the fallen angels or watchers who descended to earth, the Book of Giants focuses directly on their offspring. It names specific Nephilim, including 2 brothers named Ohia and Hahia. According to this ancient Jewish tradition, the Nephilim were not just violent monsters. They were self-aware beings capable of experiencing profound terror. In the surviving fragments, the giants begin to suffer from a series of disturbing nightmares. In one dream, a giant sees a massive tablet inscribed with many names being submerged in water. When the tablet is pulled out, all the names have been washed away except for 3. In another nightmare, they see a great garden being completely destroyed by water and fire. The Nephilim realize these visions are prophetic. They understand that a global judgment is coming, and they are absolutely horrified. The text describes the giants gathering in a great assembly. Despite their immense physical strength, they weep in fear because they know they cannot fight the coming flood. They even send a messenger named Mahaway on a desperate journey to the ends of the earth to consult the prophet Enoch. They want Enoch to intercede with the heavens on their behalf. But the answer they receive is final. The judgment is already set. What makes the Book of Giants so fascinating is not just its dramatic narrative. It is the way it interacts with the cultures surrounding ancient Israel. Among the names of the giants, preserved in the Qumran fragments, scholars found a name that shocked the archaeological world. The text mentions Gilgamesh, the legendary king of Uruk, and the hero of the most famous Mesopotamian epic. The inclusion of Gilgamesh suggests something profound about how early Jewish communities understood the Nephilim. They did not view them merely as isolated biblical anomalies. They associated the Nephilim with the legendary heroes, demigods, and mythical kings of the ancient Near East. When the nations around them celebrated stories of divine warriors and half-human kings, the Jewish scribes identified those very figures as the corrupt offspring of the fallen angels. To them, The glorious heroes of Babylon and Sumer were actually the Nephilim, the architects of an ancient rebellion that destroyed the world. This complementary evidence forces us to look back at the original biblical text with new eyes. The author of Genesis was not ignorant of these larger-than-life stories. The surrounding cultures were obsessed with demigods who brought forbidden knowledge from the heavens. So why did Genesis reduce this massive, epic tradition into 4 brief, restrained verses? Why did the biblical text intentionally strip away the names, the nightmares, and the mythology of these ancient figures? To answer that, we must step out of the Dead Sea caves and enter the historical and theological world where the book of Genesis was actually forged. Continuo para, approxima part 2. To understand why this interpretation became so influential, we need to return to the world in which the text was written. The ancient Near East was a landscape filled with towering monuments and epic literature. Long before the first Israelites emerged as a distinct nation, the empires of Mesopotamia had already established deep and complex traditions about their origins. The Babylonians, the Sumerians, and the Assyrians all possessed stories of an ancient time before a great flood. In these ancient cultures, this pre-flood era was seen as a golden age. It was a time when the gods interacted closely with humanity, sharing divine secrets and establishing the foundations of civilization. These ancient texts describe a world where the boundary between the divine and the human was fluid, allowing for the birth of legendary rulers who built the first great cities. At the center of these Mesopotamian myths were figures known as the Apkallu. According to Babylonian tradition, the Apkallu were 7 ancient sages who emerged from the watery abyss. They were often depicted as part human and part divine, sometimes possessing the features of fish or birds. These sages were credited with bringing profound knowledge to early human kings. They taught mankind the arts of building, agriculture, writing, and magic. To the ancient Babylonians, the Apkallu were glorious heroes. They were the revered ancestors who made human empire possible. But the author of Genesis viewed the world through a radically different lens. For the ancient Israelites, there was only one sovereign creator. The surrounding nations worshipped the chaotic forces of nature and venerated the mighty kings of the past as descendants of the gods. The biblical text was not written in a vacuum. It was written as a deliberate theological strike against the dominant myths of the ancient world. This helps explain the jarring brevity of the 6th chapter of Genesis. When the biblical author mentions the sons of God and the Nephilim, he is acknowledging a tradition that his ancient audience already knew. They knew the stories of the divine sages and the glorious demigods of the empires. But Genesis strips these figures of all their glory. The text refuses to give them long genealogies or celebrate their achievements. Instead of portraying them as bringers of civilization, the biblical narrative frames their existence as an unnatural breach of the cosmic order. The union between the heavenly realm and the earthly realm was not a golden age. It was the absolute corruption of creation. This theological polemic is embedded in the very language of the text. The Hebrew phrase used for the divine beings is B'nai Ha-Elohim, which translates to the sons of God. In the ancient world, kings often claimed this exact title to legitimize their ruthless conquests. But the offspring of these beings are called the Nephilim. The exact meaning of this word has been debated by linguists for centuries. The most widely accepted translation traces it to a Hebrew root meaning to fall. Under this interpretation, the Nephilim were simply the fallen ones. They were not ascending to the heavens as glorious heroes. They were falling from grace, bringing violence and ruin to the earth. Some scholars argue for a different linguistic root, suggesting the word means the fierce ones or the giants. This aligns with how early Greek translators understood the term when they produced the Septuagint. But regardless of the exact etymology, the biblical verdict is overwhelmingly negative. The text briefly admits that they were the mighty men of old, men of renown. Yet it quickly pivots to the devastating consequence of their presence. The very next verse declares that the wickedness of man was great in the earth, and that every intention of the thoughts of his heart was only evil continually. By condensing this massive ancient tradition into a few passing sentences, the author of Genesis executes a brilliant literary demotion. The text denies these entities the epic narrative they enjoyed in Babylon or Sumer. They are treated as a historical footnote, a terrible anomaly that God had to wash away with the flood. The biblical writer is essentially saying that the great heroes you have heard about from the surrounding nations were actually the very reason the world had to be destroyed. This historical and literary context provides a powerful explanation for the silence of Genesis. The author intentionally minimized the Nephilim to ensure that Israel's focus remained on the sovereign creator, rather than on the seductive mythology of the fallen divine. But this deliberate silence created a vacuum. And as the centuries passed, later generations of readers began to demand the missing details. The evidence now allows us to separate the original biblical intent from the legends that developed later. The author of Genesis left out the names, the heights, and the epic battles of the Nephilim on purpose. It was a calculated theological decision to diminish the glorification of ancient demigods. But human curiosity is a powerful force. By leaving the story unresolved, the biblical text inadvertently created a massive literary vacuum. And history shows that nature always abhors a vacuum. During the Second Temple period, roughly between the 3rd century before Christ and the 1st century of the Common Era, Jewish writers began to fill that silence. This is exactly when texts like the Book of Enoch and the Book of Giants flourished. These authors looked at the 4 brief verses in Genesis and expanded them into a cosmic tragedy. They gave the watchers names like Semjaza and Azazel. They detailed exactly what forbidden knowledge was taught to humanity, from the crafting of swords to the casting of spells. And as we saw in the Dead Sea Scrolls, they gave the Nephilim a voice, transforming them from silent giants into terrified beings facing imminent divine judgment. What the historical evidence supports is that these expanded stories were incredibly popular. They shaped the way early Jewish and Christian communities understood the origins of evil in the world. The New Testament writers themselves were highly aware of these traditions. The epistles of Peter and Jude make direct references to angels who abandoned their proper dwelling and were kept in eternal chains. But popularity does not guarantee a place in the biblical canon. While these texts provide invaluable historical context, most Christian and Jewish traditions ultimately decided not to include them in the final scriptures. They were categorized as fascinating historical commentary. but not the authoritative word of God. What remains debated is the exact historical reality behind the original Genesis account. For centuries, the question of who the sons of God actually were has divided theologians, creating three distinct camps. The earliest interpretation, supported by the Book of Enoch and the Dead Sea Scrolls, argues that they were literal angelic beings who crossed a cosmic boundary. This supernatural angelic view was widely accepted by many early church fathers and remains highly influential today. But as the early church developed, leaders like St. Augustine grew uncomfortable with the idea of spiritual beings reproducing with humans. They championed a different explanation, known as the Sethite view. Under this interpretation, the sons of God were simply the righteous human descendants of Seth, the son of Adam. The corruption occurred when they abandoned their faith to marry the ungodly daughters of Cain, losing their spiritual heritage in the process. A third explanation, often called the royal view, approaches the text from a political angle. It suggests these figures were ancient human kings and warlords who forcibly took large harems and claimed divine lineage, much like the pharaohs of Egypt or the emperors of Mesopotamia. In this view, the Nephilim were not half angels, but rather the brutal, aristocratic offspring of absolute tyrants. The available sources leave room for more than one interpretation. However, what we can say with absolute confidence is why Genesis remains so incredibly brief. The strongest interpretation appears to be that the biblical author was not interested in writing a fantasy novel. The primary focus of Genesis is the moral condition of humanity and the supreme sovereignty of God. The text reduces the mighty men of renown to a single sentence because, in the eyes of the biblical writer, their immense physical strength and ancient glory meant absolutely nothing. They were corrupt. They brought violence to the earth, and they were judged. The silence of Genesis is not a missing chapter. It is a profound theological statement. By stripping away the mythology, Genesis leaves us with a stark reminder of human frailty and divine justice. The ancient world may have worshipped the Apkallu and celebrated Gilgamesh, but the Bible consigns them to the floodwaters. The story of the Nephilim in Genesis ends almost as soon as it begins, washed away by the great deluge. But one final contradiction makes this ancient mystery even deeper. If the global flood completely destroyed the world, wiping out the Nephilim and all their corruption, how do we explain what happens next? Later in the biblical narrative, long after the waters receded, the Israelites explore the land of Canaan and report seeing giants once again. They call them the sons of Anak, and they explicitly connect them back to the Nephilim. How could any remnant of these towering, terrifying figures survive the ultimate divine judgment? If you would like our next investigation to examine the mystery of the post-flood giants and the terrified spies of Israel, leave the word Canaan in the comments below.